Hey folks, it's Ben. So you might have a weed whacker or some sort of two-cycle motor that you've either got it cheap on eBay or Fleabay or whatever, or it's just yours and it won't start. So what can you do to kind of figure out what's going wrong with it? Well, a lot of the times you can figure it out, but it might take a few procedural steps. Well, of course, you want to do the basic things first. Make sure it's got fresh gasoline. Make sure there are no broken lines that are cracked or too badly or leaking gas anywhere. That's interesting. But I can pull on it a little bit and it doesn't go anywhere, so it's probably okay. The other thing you want, like I said, make sure it's gas, and follow the instructions on starting it, because these things are very particular. A lot of times they're in the manual, so you may have to look up the model number to get the manual online. Very specific steps on how it needs to be started. But let's say you do all that and it still doesn't work, or where do you go from there? Well, typically my first step is, once everything initially is okay and you're pulling on this thing trying to get it to start and it doesn't go, is smell the exhaust. Like if you're pulling on this thing and you smell lots of gasoline, like misted gasoline, then it's probably not a carburetor issue, it's probably an ignition issue. Even if you keep wailing on this thing and you don't smell gas, it's probably an ignition issue. At least it's the easiest thing to knock out. So to check to see if it's an ignition issue, you have to find the spark plug. So in this unit here, it's right on the bottom. Now there's this, not a very hard procedure, but a way to check these out. You pull the boot off and you remove the spark plug. Now this is just a little weed whacker one. So it's only like, what's this, a 5/8. So we'll just take our socket here and we're going to go ahead and pop it off. It shouldn't be that tight. There we go. And that's about all it should be. You can take the rest out by hand. It's mostly just a surface contact. And so what we're going to do is pull the spark plug out and take a look at it. A couple things we're looking for here: that it's not black, corroded, and covered in crap, which in this case, this one isn't. It's actually in fairly okay shape. But if you need to, you can take a little sandpaper and clean the gap, that's that little center point and the little arm there. Take some sandpaper, clear that out, and then you want to gap it. And there's a special tool for that. And let me show you what that is. Here's a spark plug gap meter, and you can see on the side here there's imperial and metric usually on the other side. For spark plugs like this, if you can once again look on the internet for the manual for your engine, it's very specific. However, if you can't find it or just don't know or don't care, usually 30 thousandths is where it needs to be. So once you have it sanded, you take your gauge here, find the 30, which this one's right here, and check the gap to make sure it barely fits through. And if that's about 30, you're in good business. Any tighter and it's not going to provide enough spark. Any wider and it might not be able to make that spark connection. So once you get this cleaned up with some carburetor cleaner, you've got some sandpaper in there, it's all nice and clean, you've got it gapped correctly. Next we're going to check to see if it even works. So you do that by plugging it back into the weed whacker here. You just kind of squish it on there really tight. It'll click in a little bit. Once you get it in, that's about as hard as you can push it. Now here's the complicated part, especially on one of these machines here, is you actually need to rest the outside of the spark plug somewhere against the engine block. It can be just pushing up against it, but it needs to be grounded to something metallic, because we're looking for spark between that top pin and the pin that's in the center of the spark that's insulated. That's what this copper goes to, that's where the wire goes to, but it needs to ground out to some sort of metal. So if you can kind of just stick it back in the hole, or on bigger motors, you can typically, anywhere on the engine, you can put it against the metal here, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to take this, and I can't really set my camera down, but I'm going to set it against here, and I'm going to pull on the ignition, and you should be able to see a spark. Well, of course I can't do all things at once, but there is a very faint spark on this unit here. So there is it does have ignition, so that's half the battle, if you will, right there. So once you determine that you do have ignition source, aka the spark plug sparks, put it all back in here and we've got another place to look. Deeper in the machine we go. I've taken the cover off, and in this particular model, you notice there's a hole here that lets a blue lever kind of escape. 4 screws, 4 flathead screws, or Torx if you got them. Pull this back cover off, and this is where the meat of the machine is. What you can see here is you have obviously a fuel line that comes from the tank to the primer bulb, from the primer bulb into the carburetor, and it looks like we have a return back to the tank here. These are all position carburetors, which means you can run them upside down or backwards or forwards or whatever. So there's no bowl like in other previous videos I have. There's just a little pump that's in here. Uses the pulsing of the engine to pump fuel to the carburetor. Okay, so there's your basics of operation. If I squeeze the throttle, you can see that it grabs this little throttle valve here, and that this lever that they want 1, 2, and 3 is actually right here, is actually a choke, and you can see it covers up this hole right here. At this point, you will want to coat everything with carburetor cleaner. So you open up the choke, you spray carburetor cleaner in here. If you can without breaking anything, either through the primer bulb or through the gas tank nipple right here, you need to get cleaner into these lines and run them through this mechanism as best you can. Don't be stingy, use lots. Spray everything down, spray everything inside. You want that stuff to get in there and just dissolve any varnish or any bad things that are there. This is going to help a great deal. Now the fun part is that you can now run the mower, or in this case the weed whacker, with this back off. It's just to keep you from getting singed by the hot exhaust and to keep stuff from the inside. Now a neat thing is to double check is that there's the air filter. Make sure it's not gross. This one isn't, but make sure it's not completely plugged, because that will starve the engine for air. And the other thing is this one has an adjustment, and I think that's just idle, but it affects that little screw there, and that just pushes, as you can see on that rod that moves, it's minimum open. So the more screw you have, the more it is, but that's not going to get you going. So coat everything with carburetor cleaner, even inside. You're not going to hurt anything. It will blow white smoke if we do get it started successfully, but really it's not going to do any harm, but it is going to hopefully get your machine going again. So once you have all this cleaned up, now give it another go and see if you can get this thing started, because we've established that if you've got spark, it'll ignite, and your carburetor, without breaking it down and breaking it down part by part, that's the best you're going to get. If you do all this and it still won't start, then you're going to have to take it that extra step of taking the carburetor off the engine, taking all the little fine screws apart, visit your local Napa or parts dealer, see if you can get a little kit for this. And at that point, for the price of a weed whacker, you're getting a little, maybe I shouldn't bother. So depending on condition, it might not be worth it. Another note while I'm here, if your weed whacker really doesn't run well, it can be the carburetor being dirty. Also, I've seen the exhaust plug with carbon on these as well. So if your weed whacker runs fine, good for you. But if it doesn't, then that's one thing to look at, is to make sure that this thing doesn't get plugged up. But we'll coat this with all sorts of cleaners, and then we'll give it another try. So let me see. This one here isn't in too bad a shape. So the other thing I can do with this, and this is the scary part, is this is the choke mechanism, but you can also just use your finger. If you're brave, it shouldn't backfire on you, and you can actually kind of make sure that it's getting gasoline. And that's the key part here, is that somewhere in the gas system something's plugged and it's not letting gas into the machine. So by covering this and then pulling on it, all the suction of the engine is going towards pulling gas through, and that might pull that plug through or whatever type of crap that's in the carburetor and get gas flowing again. So let me see if I can set my camera down and see if we can pull on this thing enough to get her going. Really crappy view, but per the instructions, once again, it's like it's a lot of presses here. How many says? Press the primer bulb 10 times. That's a lot. But as you're pressing it, you can see gasoline getting pushed around. And it's kind of priming the whole fuel system here. And as I'm talking to you, I've completely forgotten how many times I pressed it in. So we do that. Then move choke lever to lever 1, which in this case closes the carburetor off completely. Seize the trigger, aka full throttle, pull the rope 5 times, then move it to number 2. Sometimes they fire up and then you can just move them to 2, but so that's 2, which is partial. And then squeeze trigger and pull 1 to 3 times to start engine. Let it idle, and then there you go. I think it needs more gas. So let's just run the choke until it starts. Oh, you're being a pain in the butt, aren't you? But I can smell gas. Well, in theory, if I'd actually sprayed the cleaner on this thing, it'd probably get going here. But I can smell gas, so I should probably just double check on my spark plug again. But that's the basics of what you need to do to see if you can get your weed whacker going again. If you got any questions, just let me know.